Jason held out the wallet, thick with cash, untouched, to a billionaire who barely spared him a glance. He could have taken everything and disappeared, yet here he stood, trembling in worn-out sneakers under 1,000 judgmental eyes. Then, one simple question changed everything. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The cold wind off Lake Michigan sliced through the towering canyons of glass and steel, tugging at Jason Miller's threadbare hoodie. He hunched his shoulders against the chill, one hand gripping the fraying strap of his backpack, the other shoved deep into his pocket for warmth. The city roared around him, honking horns, shouting vendors, the mechanical growl of a bus pulling into the curb, but none of it acknowledged his existence. He was a ghost drifting through a world too busy, too self-absorbed to notice a boy who barely scraped by. He moved with practiced purpose, weaving through the thick knots of suited commuters and oblivious shoppers. Each day after school was the same: deliver newspapers, sweep up at the corner store, haul groceries for tips barely heavy enough to feel in his palm. Every dollar counted. Every cent was a battle against the gnawing dread of eviction notices and the pharmacy clerk's cold, rehearsed sympathy when he couldn't afford his grandmother's heart medication. As he passed the glittering facade of Whitman's Emporium, a place he had never dared to enter, something gleamed on the sidewalk, incongruous against the polished marble steps and golden railings. Jason stopped short, his instincts sharp from a lifetime of spotting cans for recycling, coins dropped in gutters, any scrap worth picking up. It was a wallet. Not a battered cloth thing like his, but a sleek rectangle of fine black leather, the stitching so precise it almost seemed invisible. Jason's fingers itched as he knelt, shielding it with his body from the eyes of the street. He glanced around. No one looked his way. No hurried executive slowed their pace. No mother with shopping bags clutched her child closer. Jason was invisible, as always. He cracked the wallet open just wide enough to see the gleam of gold-edged credit cards and thick folds of cash. His breath caught in his throat. He thumbed through it carefully, his calloused fingers trembling. That's when he saw the card. Andrew Whitman, CEO, Whitman Enterprises. Jason swallowed hard. The name was legend in Chicago. Stories of skyscrapers built, industries dominated, fortunes made and lost with a stroke of this man's hand. Jason's stomach twisted. This kind of money could change everything. Enough for rent. Enough for food. Enough to fill the medicine cabinet with the pills Grandma needed instead of just rationing half doses. He stood there, the city spinning around him in a blur of noise and indifference, and felt the heavy choice pressing down on his chest. His mind painted quick, bright images. A pharmacy receipt stamped, "Paid in full." A Christmas tree for the first time in years. A soft bed for Grandma instead of the sagging couch she coughed herself to sleep on. And yet, another voice, quieter but heavier, rose from somewhere deeper inside him, an echo of a promise made long ago. What you do when no one's watching is who you really are. Jason's fingers tightened around the wallet. He zipped it shut, exhaling a shaky breath into the freezing air. No one would know, no one but him. He squared his shoulders, turned away from the easy road, and stepped back into the surging tide of strangers. Somewhere in this endless city of steel and stone, Andrew Whitman was missing something precious. And Jason Miller, a boy nobody ever noticed, was going to give it back. The skyscrapers clawed at the heavy gray sky, casting long shadows across the streets as Jason weaved through the tide of bodies. The closer he got to the Whitman Enterprises building, the smaller he felt, dwarfed by glass giants and the relentless tempo of a city that demanded everything and gave nothing. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs as he approached the entrance, a fortress of polished stone and chrome where men in sharp suits glided past without seeing him. The building's entrance loomed, guarded by two massive security officers who looked more like boulders than men. Jason stepped forward, gripping the wallet so tightly the leather dug into his fingers. The guards spotted him instantly, their faces hardening at the sight of his frayed hoodie and mud-splattered jeans. "You don't belong here, kid," one barked, his hand dropping casually to his hip where a radio and a holstered weapon hung. Jason flinched but stood his ground. He didn't reach for his backpack. He didn't make any sudden moves. He simply lifted the wallet, holding it out like a peace offering. "I found this," he said, voice cracking slightly under the weight of fear. "It belongs to Mr. Whitman." The guards exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations people have when deciding if something is worth their time. Suspicion oozed from every pore. In this part of the city, a boy like Jason wasn't expected to bring anything but trouble. After an agonizing pause, one of them jabbed a finger at a brass intercom by the door, muttering into it with clipped professional urgency. Minutes stretched like hours. Jason shifted his weight from foot to foot, acutely aware of every contemptuous glance from passers-by. Then, the door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and out stepped a man whose presence swallowed the very air. Andrew Whitman. He was everything the newspapers promised. Tall, commanding, his silver hair swept back with effortless authority. His tailored suit alone probably cost more than Jason's entire neighborhood made in a week. Whitman's steel blue eyes flicked over Jason, and in that instant, he categorized him. Street kid, liability, not worth more than a grunt of acknowledgement. Jason's throat dried up, but he found his voice. "Sir, I found your wallet outside. Thought you might want it back." He held it out, both hands extended, offering it as if it were something sacred. Whitman hesitated, his jaw tightening. The wallet, his identity, his fortune, was cradled in the dirt-smudged palms of a boy who could have vanished with it and chosen not to. He took the wallet cautiously, his fingers brushing Jason's. It was intact. Every bill, every card untouched. "Why?" Whitman asked, his voice low, almost disbelieving. Jason shrugged, the movement awkward under the weight of 100 silent judgments pressing down on him. "Because it's not mine," he said simply. Then added, almost apologetically, "My grandma says stealing stains your soul. You can't ever scrub it clean again." The words hung in the cold air between them, too honest, too raw to dismiss. Something small but real, shifted behind Whitman's polished facade. A crack in the armor. For all his billions, his boardrooms, his endless parade of yes men, here was something money couldn't buy. A scrap of decency, freely given by a boy with nothing to gain and everything to lose. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Andrew Whitman felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Not pity, not obligation, respect. Whitman's mind worked like a machine, cold and analytical, parsing every situation for advantage or risk. In his world, loyalty was something negotiated across boardroom tables and secured with iron-clad contracts. Trust was not given. It was bought. Expensively, and even then, rarely without regret. Yet standing before him was a boy who had returned more than a wallet. He had returned a fragment of faith Whitman hadn't realized he'd lost. "Come with me," Whitman said, his voice sharper than intended. Jason hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Whitman to see the caution flicker behind his eyes, then fell into step behind him. Together, they crossed the opulent marble lobby, where even the chandeliers seemed designed to whisper, "You don't belong here." The guards watched Jason pass, their faces registering confusion and something colder, resentment. In the private elevator, Whitman stood stiffly, arms crossed, staring at the rising numbers flashing above the doors. Jason clutched the straps of his backpack, his heart hammering. The silence felt heavier than the city outside, thick with unspoken calculations. What did Whitman want? What trap might be hidden beneath this polished offer of attention? At the 45th floor, the doors slid open to reveal a boardroom the size of a small cathedral. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a steel-gray sky. The table stretched endlessly, carved from some wood so rare it probably had its own security detail. Jason's sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor as he entered, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the room. Whitman gestured toward a chair. "Spend 1 week shadowing me," he said, seating himself at the head of the table like a king granting audience. "No promises, no guarantees, just an opportunity. Take it or leave it." Jason nodded once, his throat too dry to form words. Deep inside, fear clawed at him, whispering that he was out of his depth. But stronger than fear was the raw, stubborn thread that had gotten him this far, the refusal to run from a challenge. And so it began. The week unfolded like a test written in a language Jason had never been taught. But somehow, he could still read it. He learned by watching, by listening to things the others dismissed. The clipped tone of an impatient executive, the tension in a secretary's hurried steps, the look in a junior manager's eyes when a shipment went missing. Where the polished suits saw only numbers on spreadsheets, Jason saw patterns, cracks forming before they split wide open. On the third day, when a miscalculated delivery schedule threatened to bottleneck a multi-million-dollar deal, it wasn't a manager who caught it. It was Jason, a boy who noticed that 2 entries on a manifest didn't line up. He pointed it out quietly, almost apologetically, expecting to be brushed aside. Instead, the executives leaned in. Instead, Whitman listened. Jason never once asked for anything. No praise, no money, not even a thank you. He showed up early, stayed late, moved through the glittering halls with the quiet determination of someone who understood the value of every chance he'd been given, and the cost of wasting it. Whitman watched him carefully, observing not just the boy's instincts, but the core of him, the unshakable integrity, the relentless work ethic, the humility so alien in the world Whitman ruled. Each day chipped away at Whitman's cynicism, exposing something he hadn't felt in years: admiration. This boy, ragged and overlooked, wasn't just honest. He was a diamond, buried deep in the mud, surviving pressures that would have crushed lesser souls, and somehow shining all the brighter for it. The morning sun slanted through the glass towers of Chicago, casting long, molten reflections across the marble floors of Whitman Enterprises. Jason Miller stood outside the massive boardroom doors, smoothing the wrinkles from his too-big shirt and scuffed jeans. His stomach twisted itself into knots. The week had passed in a blur of long hours, sharp glances, whispered questions. Now it was over. A secretary with clipped heels and an expression of clinical indifference ushered him inside. The room had transformed. No longer just a fortress of suits and steel, it now buzzed with something softer, almost reverent. Whitman sat at the head of the gleaming conference table, surrounded by a dozen executives, men and women who, days ago, wouldn't have spared Jason a second look. Now their eyes followed him as he entered, their expressions unreadable. Jason's feet felt too heavy as he crossed the vast floor. His mind raced with possibilities. Maybe a polite thank you, maybe a handshake and a promise to keep in touch. Maybe, if he was lucky, a 50 slipped discreetly into his hand like a pat on the head. A token, a consolation prize for playing dress-up in a world that wasn't meant for him. He stopped a few feet from Whitman, heart hammering against his ribs. Whitman rose slowly, a thick envelope in his hand. No smile, no theatrics, only a measured gravity that made Jason's mouth go dry. "You came here with nothing but your word," Whitman said, his voice carrying the weight of the room. "You worked harder than anyone asked you to. You stayed when it would have been easier to quit. You never asked for a reward. You never expected one. He extended the envelope. Jason reached out, hands shaking, and took it. Inside, Whitman continued, is a full scholarship to St. James Academy, the best private school in Chicago. I'm offering you personal mentorship every step of the way, and there's a savings account already in your name, enough to start you on the path you deserve. The words barely registered. Jason fumbled open the envelope, scanning the crisp official documents, the embossed seals, the numbers too big to comprehend. His breath hitched. The world tilted under his feet. "You've earned more than a reward, Jason," Whitman said, his voice softening. "You've earned belief." For a moment, the boardroom was silent, the gravity of the moment thick enough to choke on. Then, without warning, the room erupted into applause, loud, genuine, and overwhelming. Jason blinked hard, willing the burning in his eyes to stop. It didn't. For the first time in his life, he was seen not as a burden, not as a problem to be solved or ignored, but as hope. A symbol of something rare and desperately needed. A reminder that integrity still had a place in a world obsessed with shortcuts and profit. When he finally stepped back into the cold Chicago air, the scholarship papers pressed tightly against his chest, the city no longer seemed so vast, so hostile. The towers didn't loom. They shined. Jason looked up at the endless skyline, and a fierce, determined smile broke across his face. For the first time, he wasn't surviving. He was beginning. And he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that honesty, even when unseen and unrewarded, had the power to rebuild a life, and maybe even change the world.